things took a rather unexpected turn that Mother's Day when I got a call from Dawn's wife. This video is dedicated to Crystal Judson, a mother and victim of domestic violence who was murdered by her husband, Tacoma Police Chief David Brame. On April 26, 2003, Brame shot and fatally wounded Crystal in front of their 2 children before turning the gun on himself. Before succumbing to her injuries, Crystal's father, Lane, made her a promise. "I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure this doesn't ever happen to anyone again." In December of 2005, Congress passed the Crystal Judson Domestic Violence Protocol Program, which provides federal funding for law enforcement agencies to implement domestic violence policies and training. That same month, the Crystal Judson Family Justice Center opened in Tacoma, Washington. The Family Justice Center has helped countless victims, including myself, connect with professionals from a wide variety of social services and government agencies to offer help and support while determining their next steps. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence, please visit thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-SAFE or 7233 for more information and resources. No one deserves abuse, and there is help out there. Hi, hello, and welcome back. Or if you are new here, welcome. My name is Heather. This is Miss Finn. And here on Nice People, we talk about the kinds of things nice people don't talk about. This video is actually part 2 of a series I'm doing inspired by Netflix's I Am a Stalker. And if you haven't seen part 1, be sure to check that out if you haven't already. Before we dive into today's video, I do need to warn you, I'm going to be talking about some pretty triggering things. If you've watched my other videos, you know that I tend to stay away from sharing gory details, if you will. But I've decided to share some of them in this video because, well, there's a few reasons. Number 1 is because while writing the script for this video, I realized that the biggest reason why I feel the need to refrain from sharing these things is because I still feel ashamed that they happened to me. I guess part of me still believes that I deserved it or that it was my fault. And I guess I still feel like it reflects poorly on me that I was a victim or am a survivor of intimate partner violence. So I need to go about changing that. The second reason is because I think people need to know that these things happen. If you've experienced them yourself, it helps to know that other people know what you're going through and can understand you. And also for those who haven't experienced it themselves and can't imagine how anyone ends up in an abusive relationship or why people stay in them. And this story is by no means the worst of what people experience in these kind of abusive relationships. But it's still pretty bad, and I think it would do some good for other people to know. As always, I am going to be mindful of how I talk about these things, but just know that I am going to be sharing experiences of intimate partner violence, and so please look out for yourself and skip this one if you need to. And with that, let's get into the story. This all began in late 2015, actually a few months after things ended with Kelly. And at the time, I wasn't looking for anything serious because I was about to leave for flight attendant training for about a month. But I thought it would be fun to date some people in the meantime, so I got on a dating website, and it wasn't long before I met Don. He was this huge, muscular guy, from Virginia who was here in Washington doing some contract work. He was never married, no kids, and we had a really good time together. So much so, in fact, that I started to kind of reconsider the not serious thing. But about a month into us dating, I caught him in a pretty major lie. One night, we were going to dinner, and right before we went to the restaurant, he unprivated his social media account. And we went into the restaurant, sat down, and then Dawn went to the bathroom. And in the meantime, I was going through his social media page and came across a picture of his kid. This guy told me he had never been married and had no kids. So when he returned from the bathroom, I confronted him about it and was pretty done with him at this point. Because if he would lie about something like that, what else would he lie about? But he gave me an understandable reason, or understandable to me at the time.
You are so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
And it was something like he'd only seen his son a handful of times since he was born and hadn't seen him in years. His mother had since remarried and her husband had adopted him. And that basically, for all intents and purposes, he didn't have kids. But I still wasn't entirely convinced, so he went a step further and paid for and did a background check right there in front of me, just to prove that he didn't have some kind of serious baggage, red flags, arrests, things like that in his history. And he came up clean. So I made one of the worst decisions I've made in my life. I continued seeing him. But I was still going to be leaving for flight attendant training pretty soon, and I knew we'd go our separate ways, so it's not like it was going to go anywhere anyway. But over the next 6 weeks or so, he really grew on me. And we didn't want to end things just because I was going to be leaving for a month. Instead of going our separate ways, we ended up together and trying to figure out how to make things work long distance. We stayed together, I went away to training, and then about a week before training was supposed to wrap up, I fell and broke my wrist, which meant I had to leave training and go back home to heal and do physical therapy. They did say I could come back once I was all healed up and good to go, but I would have to start the training over. But still, I planned to return to flight attendant training and that career as soon as I got the okay from the physical therapist. But about halfway through my physical therapy, my lease was up. And at that time, I had been living with my grandma. We got an apartment together because I needed a roommate and she didn't want to live in a senior home. And my Grammy's cool as shit. So we got a place together. That was all great. But instead of renewing our lease, she decided that she wanted to go back into a senior home. So I was kind of in a bad spot. I couldn't afford a place on my own, and technically I was jobless. And now I had no one to take care of Miss Finn while I was away at training. But it just so happened that Dawn's contract was up at the same time, which included housing for him here in Washington. And he decided he wanted to stay in Washington, so he needed a place as well. So we got a place together.
You are really dumb. For real.
Way too soon. Not ideal. But I really didn't have any other options. And I also wasn't too worried about it because I knew that in just a few weeks, I'd be returning to flight attendant training. I'd very likely end up based out of some other city. So I wasn't that worried about it. It was temporary. And it was. Just not for the reasons I anticipated. In the months that followed, I started to see a whole new side to not just Dawn, but myself. And the funny thing is, while I was writing this script, I could not remember how I went from point A, being this sociable, ambitious, promising career person who wasn't that serious about Dawn to begin with, to point B, a shadow of my former self. Timid, depressed, no self-worth, low self-esteem, dependent, and in love with Dawn. And it took a little bit for it to click with me that, oh yeah, because that's what happens in abusive relationships. They almost never start out horrible and abusive, otherwise they wouldn't get very far. There's tons of literature out there, from research, statistics, firsthand accounts from survivors, that all kind of say the same thing. Basically, that anyone can end up in an abusive relationship without even really knowing how it happened. Victims of psychological abuse are most often the kind of people you wouldn't think would be vulnerable to such a thing. According to Shannon Thomas, a therapist and author of the book Healing from Hidden Abuse, success and strength are actually what attract abusive narcissists and psychopaths to their targets. Once the perpetrator is attached to that relationship, whether it's in a work environment or a romantic relationship, Thomas says they will then start to try to tear down the qualities and success that drew them there to begin with. Psychological abuse starts with something small, such as your partner snapping at you for something that you wouldn't expect them to. This goes against everything they started off as, when they were in the love bombing stage. So often it's brushed off as an out-of-character moment. However, as Thomas puts it, these moments get more and more frequent, like an IV drip of poison. It happens so slowly that you don't realize it's happening. Yeah, that is totally what happened with me. It was like an IV drip of poison. Things were not good. I wasn't happy, and I was constantly trying to please and placate Dawn, but things only got worse. He talked me out of going back to my flight attendant job, and not even with convincing points, just things like, I don't trust other men and you're gonna cheat on me, mixed with what I knew would be a constant fight if I was unavailable to him. I wanted out, but we lived together, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. So the first thing I did was get a job. I didn't have many options, and it was minimum wage, and they would only work me 39 hours a week so that they didn't have to give me any benefits. I think after taxes, I was bringing in like $200 a week. Yeah, not even close to being able to move out on my own. So I was just biding my time, trying to get through the day without having a fight with Dawn until I could work out my exit. But once I got a job, things with Dawn went from bad to worse pretty quickly. He was suspicious of every guy I worked with. He'd show up to my work to spy on me, and if I talked to a male coworker or customer, I would have to spend the rest of the day defending against and debunking all of his accusations. Dawn couldn't keep a job to save his life, so we were barely getting by, and the constant threat of eviction and homelessness and fights and cheating accusations just really took a toll on me. And it was around this time that he began essaying me. The first time it happened, I hadn't been in the mood to have sex with him in probably a few weeks. I don't remember how long it was. I felt like shit all the time, so I wasn't in the mood. And then one day, he started in with his accusations that I was cheating on him, which was nothing new. And I just didn't have it in me to fight about it anymore. I knew it was a losing battle, or just a way to kind of bait me into some other argument. And I unintentionally did kind of the gray rock method of just not responding to it. I'm sure I said something to the effect of, "No, Dawn, I'm not cheating on you. I'm just not in the mood." But my non-reactivity only angered him more. And he said, "Well, if you're not getting it from me, you're getting it from someone else." And he grabbed me and forced me onto the floor and raped me. And I wasn't the same after that. I was pretty dead inside and just didn't care what happened to me anymore. For example, at one point, I was pretty sure Dawn had an STD, but I didn't even care if I caught it. There was also about a month where I wasn't able to get my birth control for some reason. I don't remember why. But despite my not wanting to get pregnant, Dawn would still SA me without protection. And ever since I became sexually active, having an unplanned pregnancy was a huge fear of mine. Huge. But I became so detached from the reality of what was happening to me that I just resigned to it. And all I could think was, if I get pregnant, that's a problem for another day. I'm just trying to survive this one. I couldn't even really think of the future anymore or come up with a plan to get out. Things were pretty bad. But it still felt, and in all honesty, probably was, the better of the two options I had, which was staying in the hell I knew or leaving and being homeless and all of the uncertainty and dangers and challenges that would bring. No matter how bad it got, I knew things could be a whole lot worse if I left. Things took a rather unexpected turn that Mother's Day when I got a call from Dawn's wife. Yeah, turns out Dawn had a wife and a 7-month-old child back in Virginia. News to me. I don't remember exactly what she said. I just remember she was very angry at me, understandably, and hurt and confused, also understandably. I think I just kept saying sorry and telling her that I didn't know. And it wasn't too long before Dawn realized who I was talking to. And he was pissed. He came over to me and took the phone and hung up. And I actually don't remember what happened after that. I'm sure it wasn't good. That phone call wasn't the last time I talked to his wife, though. I had actually secretly kept in contact with her and found out from her that basically everything Dawn had told me about himself was a lie. Turns out he had been married 3 times and had 4 kids. I didn't know who he was at all. And that was really unsettling to me. And I wanted to leave, but again, I didn't have anywhere to go and didn't have the money to get my own place. So I had to stay and continue to try and figure out something and do everything that I could to minimize the stress and abuse from Don. But no matter what I did or didn't do, he would always find a way to initiate a fight or come up with new things to be routinely pissed at me about, like wanting me to co-sign on a car loan for him, which no matter how much control he had over me, that was never going to happen. I knew I was going to regret that. But he'd still make me go and test drive cars with him. And if I said that I didn't want to, he would get mad and I would pay for it for the rest of the day. So it was just easier to go with him. But then he'd still get mad because then when he'd go to work out the details with the salesman, I wouldn't co-sign on a loan for him. So then he'd be pissed at me anyway. There was literally no winning in that situation. Another thing he'd make me do, oftentimes after pointlessly test driving cars, was something I still find particularly cruel, which was to take me to animal shelters and have me play with the dogs. And then when he'd say he wanted to adopt one, I would have to be the one to say no. There are very few things that instantly crush me, and one of them is mistreated and or abandoned animals in need of a home. He knew it broke my heart seeing them, and that I wanted nothing more than to take every one of them home with me, but I couldn't. He knew the answer was always no, and no matter how much it hurt me, he'd still make me do it. Seems pretty obvious to me now. It was a way to punish me for not co-signing on a car loan with him. The day it all ended started out really pretty normal. Actually, no, it was arguably a good day because there hadn't been any kind of tension between us. We had gone to the mall, and as we were leaving, we stopped at Chipotle to get some food to eat on the way home. I got a burrito. This is relevant. On the way home, Don said that he wanted to go test drive cars, to which I replied that I didn't want to. So, of course, he got mad. And he was driving really erratically, like high rates of speed, slamming on the brakes last minute, that kind of stuff. And I just kept eating my burrito and didn't even care if we crashed. And more importantly, wasn't letting him know that it was affecting me in any way. We made it to our apartment complex, and he was still driving like an ass. And by this point, I was at the very tail end of my burrito. I'll try and post pictures here of what I'm talking about. Basically, I just had the last little bit of it, and it wasn't wrapped anymore. I just had it kind of sitting on top of the foil, kind of taking bites from it that way. I never touch food with my bare hands. So we go tearing into the parking lot, and he sped up and then slammed on the brakes last minute before we hit a speed bump, and my burrito went flying. Surprisingly, it didn't make a giant mess. It just kind of wedged itself between the windshield and the dashboard. But Don fucking snapped. He felt that I had disrespected his belongings, so he proceeded to destroy mine. And he'd already broken most of my furniture by this point, but he was doing things like putting my PlayStation in the kitchen sink and filling it with water. And I don't really know how to explain it. Just grabbing everything he could and throwing it across the room. I went to call the police after he started loading up his car with my belongings, and he grabbed my hand with my phone in it and squeezed it so hard that I don't know if this is actually what he was trying to do, but it was like he was trying to break my phone with my hand. And this hurt pretty bad. So I was kind of trying to twist and free myself from his grip. And when I did, he grabbed my arm, like down here, and squeezed it really hard to where like my hand was kind of forced open and my phone fell out. Surprisingly, he didn't take my phone or try to break it once I dropped it. But he did take off after that. I called the police and they came and took some pictures of the apartment and my hand and wrist and were doing up their report. And lo and behold, Don shows up. I have no clue what he came back for or what he ended up telling the police, but they didn't let him inside and they told him that he needed to go. And he did. Once the cops were done doing up their report, they gave me a copy of it and told me to take it to management in the morning if I wanted to get my locks changed, and then told me where to go if I wanted to get a protection order. And then they were on their way. First thing in the morning, I went to the property manager's office to tell him what was going on, give them a copy of the police report, and request that my locks get changed. I wanted to change them before I went to get the protection order because I couldn't bring Miss Finn with me, and I was really afraid that Don was going to either take her or hurt her or kill her. So I wanted to make sure she was going to be safe before I went anywhere. Also, this was the middle of August, so I couldn't have brought her and just left her in the car. Way too hot. So the property manager took a copy of the report, said that someone would come by to change the locks, and wouldn't give me a time frame. And I really stressed to them that it was important this get done quickly because the cutoff time to file for protection orders was 1 p.m. Well, to make a long story short, nobody came. And so when I finally got a hold of the property manager again, she said that they had decided they weren't going to change my locks because Don was still on the lease and I didn't have a protection order saying he couldn't be there. Cool. Could have let me know. They were just the worst. They get worse too, by the way. So I didn't get my locks changed that day, and Don showed up later and unlocked the door, walked right in, and he did the whole, my name's on the lease and I pay rent here, so this is my apartment. I'm not going anywhere.
I have proof that I pay the rent in this house, so I'm not leaving.
Thankfully, he didn't stay. I think he just came to get his pillow or something. I don't really remember. But the whole thing just really emphasized that I wasn't safe from him and he wasn't done messing with me, and that he could come into the apartment anytime he wanted. The next day, I had a friend go with me to sit in the car with Miss Finn while I filed for the protection order, and they granted me the temporary protection order and told me that I had 2 weeks to serve Don the papers before I could get a court date and the temporary protection order expired. The only problem was I didn't know where Don was. And even if he showed up to the apartment again, I couldn't be the one to serve him. So that was a big worry for me. But thankfully, I was able to serve him just a few days later. Get this. I was coming home with a friend of mine, and we were in her car. And we pulled in, and there was Don in his car, like in between two much larger vehicles in a covered parking spot, like very clearly trying to hide from me. Your guess is as good as mine as to what he was planning to do or why he was doing that. My friend was not intimidated by him at all. So she blocked him in with her car and took the papers, went up to his window, just kind of threw them at him, and he was served.
You suckers got served.
So that was a relief. But now I felt like I had kicked the hornet's nest and I didn't know what he was going to do. And I was scared of him. I was afraid that he was going to kill me. And even more afraid that he was going to hurt or kill Miss Finn. Every time I had to leave for work, I was sick with fear that he was going to break in and do something to her. God, that was just the worst. I really can't put into words what that kind of constant terror is like. I was scared all the time. I couldn't sleep. And even when I did manage to drift off to sleep, I would dream, thinking I was awake, that Dawn burst into my room with a knife and would kill Miss Finn in front of me before turning on me. And then I'd wake up in a full-blown panic attack. And this went on night after night after night. Luckily, I had some really good friends who would come and sleep at my place. So that helped a little bit, but also kind of made me afraid for them. It was just a really rough few weeks leading up to the court date. At our hearing, I was really nervous. I didn't know what to expect, seeing as how I had never done this before, and also having to be that close to Dawn. The first thing Dawn said to the judge was something like he thought the whole thing should be thrown out because he wasn't served properly. A lie. And I think he was really banking on that to work because he seemed very unprepared for the rest of the hearing. Of course, the judge went through the paperwork and verified that he was served properly and added, "Well, clearly you knew to be here, so let's proceed." Basically, the judge looked over the paperwork and asked me why I felt like I needed a protection order, and then asked Dawn his side of the story. He tried to say that I was just a bitter ex who wouldn't leave him and his family alone, and that all he wanted to do was get back to his wife and son and live out their lives peacefully.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
The gall of this guy. I was granted the protection order. However, I still had a major, if not arguably larger, problem. Rent was due in a couple of days, and I knew that Dawn was not going to pay for any of it, and I couldn't even come close to covering the rent myself. I'd already told management what was going on, and they told me that my only options were to either find someone to take over Dawn's part of the lease or find someone to take over the entire thing. I had like a week and a half to do that. I wasn't able to find anyone or cover the rent myself, so they immediately began the process of evicting me. I had nowhere to go, and there were no beds available at any of the women's shelters in my county, and they didn't even put me on wait lists because I don't have kids. So things were looking pretty bleak. I wanted to take a little moment here to share with you something I wish I had known when I was going through this, and that everyone should know. The property manager lied to me, and it is not uncommon for them to lie about this. In Washington state, and I believe it's all states, victims of domestic and intimate partner violence can break their lease without penalty. Of course, they didn't tell me that, so I ended up with an eviction on my record that prevented me from getting housing for over 4 years. If this has happened to you or someone you know and you live in Washington state, although be sure to check for this in your state because you may very well have something like this, you can get what's called an order of limited dissemination, which hides DV-related wrongful evictions from background checks. I was able to get free legal assistance for it, and I kid you not, I didn't even have to explain to the attorney what had happened. He said, "Oh, let me guess. They didn't inform you that you could break your lease without penalty and then evicted you?" Yeah, that happens a lot. The property manager was so clearly and egregiously wrong for what they did to me that I didn't even have to go to court to have the motion granted. The eviction is still on my record, though, and still prevented me from getting housing for 4 years. But there is no one holding these people accountable, and they just get away with it. Just one more thing I'm going to have to get legislation passed for. Anyway, just wanted to let y'all know that. Something I wished I had known when I was going through all this. Now back to the story. I never saw Dawn again after that day in court, but I suffered some pretty major consequences in the years that followed, like not being able to secure housing for 4 years, as well as the psychological damage that it did to me. I regularly had nightmares about Dawn for probably 6 to 8 months following all this. And to this day, like this literally happened not even a week ago. Whenever I see a car that looks like his or the one that he had during that time, I immediately panic, get that feeling like I've missed the last step or I've tripped and fallen and the ground is rushing up at me. Even though I know there's no way he still has that car, I'm sure it got repossessed within months of the last time I saw him, but it still gets to me. Every now and again, I will look him up just to see if he's even in Washington anymore or if he's in jail. And the last time I checked, he was still in Washington, not far from where we lived and still not far from where I live now. He's had several run-ins with the law since our whole ordeal. His most recent legal issue was being caught shooting baby Canadian geese in a pond near his home because, according to him, they were defecating on his car. We all know how he feels about his cars. Just a real piece of shit. That whole experience also affected my ability to trust people. Thankfully, not in a significant way, but I found that whenever I feel certain that I know a person or what they're capable of, a little seed of doubt will get planted. You might think you know them, but remember Dawn? One of the most commonly asked questions, if not the most commonly asked question about abusive relationships and intimate partner violence is, well, why does the person stay? There are lots of reasons why. Fear, shame, intimidation, low self-esteem, lack of resources, disability, immigration status, cultural customs and beliefs, children, and even love. These kinds of relationships are about power and control. And when you're not the one with any power or control, and especially if you don't have the resources or a network to support you in leaving can be impossible. There's a whole section on the hotline.org that talks about the different reasons why people stay in these kinds of relationships, and I highly suggest you check that out. If you or someone you know is experiencing intimate partner violence, please visit the hotline.org But if you believe your internet activity might be tracked, they recommend you call them instead at 1-800-799-SAFE. Or you can text START to 88788. They'll walk you through the steps. There's a lot, so I can't go into all of them. And they even have a section for men who are victims, because men can be victims too. And oftentimes they believe that there isn't any help for them out there, which isn't the case. No one deserves to be abused, period. So yeah, that's my story about Dawn. If you liked this video or found it helpful in any way, please consider liking it. It does help a lot. Don't forget to subscribe before you leave if you want to keep getting videos like this from me. And be sure to hit that bell icon so that you'll be notified whenever I do post a new video. And with that, I hope you all have a great week, and I'll be seeing you next week with my latest Spravato update. Say goodbye, Finn. Okay, bye.